Hello. Huh? Is my hair just wet? Is that all it is? I think it's just shiny. It's like, is there something in my hair? But no, it's just shiny. Because I had a shower. Also, hello. Happy Wednesday. Nice to see you. I'm not weird. You're weird. Benedict's not weird. Although, he's a little pushy. He really wants snacks. And he knows I have them for him. But he wants them now. Or really, he wanted them 7 minutes ago. What? Snacks? Alright, but you gotta earn it. You may earn it by doing a dance. Can you spin? Good boy. He did the little. That was very cute. Excuse me. So it's Wednesday, the 11th of January. We are almost halfway through the first month of the year. Sort of. I mean, in another 4 to 5 days, we'll be halfway through, right? Guess it's not really almost. We are 1/3 of the way through the first month of the year. Slightly more than. It's hard to be precise with fractions with months. We are 11/31 of the way through the first month of the year. There we go. Precise. As long as you don't count the hours in the day. Which now I can't help but do. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. That's what I wanted to do. There we go. So, took Ben all over the world today. By which I mean, took him to the park to run around for a while, and then took him to get his nails trimmed. And then not much else. That's how my day's gone. Actually woke up at a reasonable hour because I did not sleep the night before last. Got his nails did. But he's behind me. Oh, he's beside me. He wants more snack. Can you do another dance? Can you see? Yes, you can see. You can almost reach it. Jump! 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 He did it. Good boy. So hopefully I'll fall asleep at a reasonable hour tonight and then get back onto a more normal schedule. For sleeping. I feel like I've just got nothing to say right now. How about that? What's new with you? Any exciting adventures? Any... Look at that droopy tail. You can't see his face, but his tail is going droop. There he is. What are you doing over there? Why are you like kind of facing the like filing cabinet? You okay? Are you starving for lack of snacks? Rice cakes aren't very filling, unfortunately. Ah, well. He'll be okay. Farmhouse has school tomorrow. First kind of real full day, isn't it? Since last week was more of an introductory day, I imagine. The Sharkies! We are here! We're here! Welcome! How you doing? How you doing? You haven't missed much. I kind of rambled on about how far into the month we are. And settled on how far we are is slightly over 11/31 of the way into the month. For accuracy's sake. Average, which is to say good for mid-January. Good for 11/31 of the way through January. Slightly more than 11/31. Are y'all recovering all right from your seasonal colds? I'm all right myself. So far, so good. For a little while. Yeah. Took Ben to get his nails trimmed today after a run around in a park. And our roommate is moving out on Sunday. So I'll be one of those lots of furniture moving type days because I'm helping him move, of course. Empty nest. So that's gonna... I might try to find some time to paint some minis on Saturday, but otherwise that's gonna occupy my weekend. And then a week from Sunday, the 22nd, is Lunar New Year. And hopefully I need to talk to my Sifu. Yeah, well, that's how it works. It's not just an empty nest when there's only one person in a house. Yeah, Lunar New Year's on the 22nd, and hopefully I'll be doing a lion dance somewhere on that day. So that'll be cool if that's the case. We're moving into Year of the Rabbit. Going to see family you missed seeing on Christmas. Belated Ukrainian Christmas dinner. I'm sure we've talked about this before, but what goes into a Ukrainian Christmas dinner? I'm not going to make any guesses. Put our house up for sale? Yeah, hopefully, yeah. Pierogies for sure, yeah, okay. I mean, I said I wasn't going to make any guesses, but that would have been at the top of my list. If I did. What do you put in your pierogies? Potatoes? Bacon? Onion? Anything else? Any of those not included? Cheese? What's your favorite pierogi filling? A lazy version of cabbage rolls. No rolling. Just the ingredients in a big roaster. Alright. So you take the ingredients that would normally go into a cabbage roll and you make a casserole? Is that a cabbage casserole? Casserole? Potato and cheese. Yeah, I think those are kind of my two standard. Like, I wouldn't object to bacon bits, but I don't usually like pierogies that have onion bits in them because I don't like the unexpected crunch and like I don't know, onions cooked in things are off-putting to me. Rice, bacon, onions, and cabbage. The less cabbage than would be in rolls. Benedict is waiting very patiently, by which I mean not very patiently, for more rice cracker bits. If I just hold on to a snack like this, he doesn't really try to steal it. He waits for me to let go. Oh, oh. That all sounds quite good. Very filling, but that's a good thing. Yeah, speaking of food, last Friday, I don't know, I was all set to keep reading, to continue, because we finished the one chapter and it wasn't like even 8 o'clock yet, and so I was like, all right, let's keep going. And then we got partway into the chapter and I was just like, whoa, I need to eat. Oh, like I got that like wave of like lightheaded, like, I should have eaten more today. Cornmeal baked pudding called nachinka. Interesting. So yeah, that's why I was kind of abrupt in wrapping up the stream on Friday, because it was just like, my body is telling me that I need to go and eat food now. Which is a little unfortunate because I was actually quite looking forward to the chapter that we were in. Like ahead of time. And I was like, I've been anticipating that particular chapter. So I was a little not thrilled with myself for stopping where I did. Very much early mid-century Ukrainian Canadian food. Especially because, it's a Friday, so I was like, ugh, now I've got to wait until next Wednesday to actually get to that chapter, to the rest of that chapter. Benny, you licking your paws? Why are you licking your paws? Is it because we trimmed your nails? Took you to get your nails trimmed? Or are they just delicious, maybe? Filling farmer food? So, where were we last Friday? We finished the entirety of chapter 10, which is where Leldorin returned. I mean, I guess technically he probably... No, he returned in chapter 10. And told us what he's been up to over the past week. Technically, he probably mentioned what he'd been up to before that, which was loitering around Baron Ulterain's castle. Castle? Castle or keep or whatever. But, then he got a letter from Aunt Pol saying to head to Riva. And that's where he sprung into action. for for some reason that inspired him to just decide he needed to take on Arendia. As he and what's her name? Ariana. He and Ariana made their way from her home to Uriva. Let's do a quick summary. Yeah. So let's do a quick summary. Need to talk with you. Things went wrong. He was at the castle. So he thumped a guard on the head to escape out the door without being stopped. And said guard probably didn't die. Then they were pursued by the Baron and his men. So he shot several of their horses, during which he caused Baron Ulterain's leg, which had just healed from being broken, to be broken by the horse falling on it. Then he beat a priest, knocking out some of said priest's teeth in the process, until the priest would wed the two of them. Then he, I guess, stopped by his uncle's house, estate, where he ran his cousin through the leg a little. And as a result of all of these things, he got a price put on his head by the king of Arendia. I think that's all of the big details that he mentioned. As Garion said, you stole Baron Ulterain's sister, married her without his consent, broke his leg, and assaulted several of his people and a priest. That was everything that happened? And then that's where he brought up running his cousin through the leg a little. And the crown putting a price on his head. Yeah. Yeah, that's everything that he mentioned. Just spending most of his time trying not to kill people. Which, you know, it's tough, right? Can we get a review of the bingo card? Absolutely. We also then, let's see, we met Barak's children, including his new son, which was Unrak. We also met his daughters, Terzi and Gundrid. And it seemed like maybe things are on their way to mending between he and his wife. Yeah. So that was chapter 10. We'll go over the bingo card and then talk about the players at home. So we are waiting on Garion doing something unexpected. We've had instances of unusual descriptive words. Garion being clueless about Sinedra, that definitely happened, and angst. We've had multiple instances of angst, I think. We've yet to all be satisfied by Silk being very sarcastic, though he has repeatedly been sardonic. There's been little to no Pyrodernic. There's been little to no Mandaralan at all. There has been crying. I haven't noticed Belgarath being itchy or Garion eavesdropping specifically. There hasn't been very much Taiba and Relg. We visited Faldor's farm. It wasn't just mentioned, we went there. And of course, we have had a few instances of Bard. Garion hasn't done too much magic. As a result, Belgarath and Pol haven't been snobby about it. I'm still like, this is near. This one was real close. I feel like this one, someone being kidnapped. It's just that she was willing to be to go. So she kind of left on her own. But I think the rest of Erendia probably thinks she's been kidnapped. Garion hasn't really gotten cocky. Silk, again, hasn't done very much. We haven't really had any noticeable instances of divinity, but we have had a guard get, thumped over the head. So there's that. Uncomfortable situation. He had a bad sleep, but it's not really qualifying for what we were talking about with that. I feel like Senedra has chastised Garion about manners, but I don't think Aunt Pol has, really. Though she has told him to wear nice clothes. Again, not much Relg. Erend has definitely offered multiple people the orb. And, we have had Barak, but he was not suggesting violence. He was hugging children. He was cuddling babies and children, not threatening murder. Kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. Garion, yeah, that's true. He didn't want to look at them looking at each other, but he wasn't forced to stay there, and it didn't, nothing happened, so it is kind of, I thought, cute that Garion and Leldoran were sharing a room for sleeping arrangements. Oh, and speaking of sleeping arrangements, he's not sleeping. You can't really see because the computer's in the way, but he is, staring at me over the edge of his bed. So then we got about halfway through chapter 11, which was largely occupied by Garion having all sorts of weird dreams. Largely revisiting portions of his life and mostly the adventure, but part of it was from his childhood with Rundurig. And people asking him to do things and saying that, waiting for him to do things and asking him if he's ready over and over and over. Which was somewhat repeated also just in real life. He woke up and he and Leldoran spent some time talking, and then when Leldoran went to put out the light, he asked, "Are you ready?" And then in the morning when he woke up, feeling oddly lightheaded as if his troubled sleep had done him more harm than good, he went to visit his aunt. I guess actually he went to visit Dernick first, down in the stables. And then they wished each other a joyous Aristide. Speaking of holiday dinners. And then he went to visit Aunt Pol, where he found many of the ladies helping Princess Senedra get ready bright and early. "Do you like her hair?" she asked him. "That's not the way you usually wear it." "We're all aware of that, Garion." So then, let's see. Aunt Pol sent him to have a bath and wear his nice clothes for Aristide. And that's where we left off. He was going to find Silk, who does occupy 2 spots on our bingo sheet. So we'll see how sarcastic he's being. I don't think there'll be much opportunity for him to be a rogue, but I could be mistaken about that. considering he's going to get Silk to show him the way to the baths. So, are you ready? In my copy, we're on page 103. That probably does not apply to anybody else, because this copy is weird. I reached in this direction and Bin's head perked up. Better come up and get it, where everyone can see. Was I? Oh. Did I do a this copy is weird? I didn't notice. All right. I'll just go back to the top of this page, roughly. Let's see. Aunt Pol turned to Garion. "Get some breakfast and have someone show you the way to the baths," she instructed. "They're in the cellars under the west wing. After you've bathed, you'll need a shave. Try not to cut yourself. I don't want you bleeding all over your good clothes." "Do I have to wear all that?" She gave him a look that immediately answered that question, as well as several others he might have asked. "I'll go find Silk," he agreed quickly. "He'll know where the baths are." "Do that," she told him quite firmly, "and don't get lost. When the time comes, I want you to be ready." Garion nodded and left. Her words had somehow strangely echoed the words of his dream, and he wondered about that as he went looking for Silk. Something that's not really explicitly pointed out here, but more sort of hinted at, is that Aunt Pol has clearly spent some time in Riva over... Sorry, just thought people might want to see what he was up to back there. Getting comfortable by the fire, which isn't lit right now, but just... he knows where the cozy spots in the house are. So, Aunt Pol's clearly spent some time in Riva, because it was mentioned when he went to find her. He found her in the company of women in the apartment that appeared to have been set aside for her personal use centuries before. And also, I mean, they've been here for a day, but she's telling him, like, the baths are in the cellars under the west wing. You know, she just knows that. If you tell a Garion to get ready, he'll need a bath. If he needs a bath, he'll need Silk to find them. If he... After taking a bath, he'll need to shave. If you give a mouse a cookie... Ben, people are allowed to exist outside. I know, they're noisy. I know. Okay, that's enough. Hey, that's enough. Oh. Lay down. Why don't you go get cozy again? He's all nervous. It looked like the lighting on my video is adjusting itself. Weird. Okay, so he wondered about that as he went looking for Silk. The little man was lounging in the company of the others in a large torch-lit room in the west wing. The kings were there, with Brand, Belgarath, and Garion's other friends. They were breakfasting on cakes and hot spiced wine. Well, it is Aristide. "Where did you go this morning?" Leldoran asked him. "You were gone when I woke up." "I couldn't sleep any more," Garion replied. "Why didn't you wake me?" "Why should you lose sleep just because I'm having a restless night?" Garion could see that they were deep in a discussion, and he sat down quietly to wait for the opportunity to speak to Silk.
"I think we've managed to aggravate Tar Urgas pretty thoroughly in the past couple of months,"
Barak was saying. The big man was sprawled deep in a high-backed chair with his face sunk in the shadows from the flaring torch behind him.
"First Relg steals Silk right out from under his nose, then Belgarath destroys Ktuchik and knocks down Rak Thol in the process of taking back the orb. And finally, Chohag and Hetar exterminate a sizable piece of his army when he tries to follow us. The king of the Murgos has had a bad year."
The big man's chuckle rumbled out of the shadows. For a moment, a fleeting instant, Garion seemed to see a different shape sprawled there. Some trick of the flickering light and dancing shadows made it appear momentarily that a great, shaggy bear sat in Barak's place. Then it was gone. Garion rubbed at his eyes and tried to shake off the half-bemused reverie that had dogged him all morning. I still don't quite follow what you mean about Relg going into the rock to rescue Prince Keldar." King Fulrak frowned. I don't know if he always had this, but this is kind of becoming the Sendarian accent, I feel like, for some reason. "Do you mean that he can burrow through?"
"I don't think you'd understand unless you saw it, Fulrak," Belgarath told him. "Show him, Relg."
The Ulgo zealot looked at the old man, then walked over to the stone wall beside the large window. Silk instantly turned his back, shuddering. "I still can't stand to watch that," he declared to Garion. "Aunt Pol said I was supposed to ask you the way to the baths," Garion said quietly. It's not exactly how it went. "She wants me to get cleaned up and shaved, and then I guess I'm supposed to put on my best clothes." "I'll go with you," Silk offered. "I'm sure that all these gentlemen are going to be fascinated by Relg's demonstration, and they'll want him to repeat it. What's he doing?" "He stuck his arm through the wall, and he's wiggling his fingers at them from outside the window," Garion reported. Silk glanced once over his shoulder, then shuddered again and quickly averted his eyes. "That makes my blood cold," he said with revulsion. "Let's go bathe." "I'll go along," Leldoran said, and the three of them quietly left the room. The baths were in a cavernous cellar beneath the west wing of the citadel. There were hot springs deep in the rock, and they bubbled up to fill the tiled chambers with steam and a faintly sulphurous smell. There were but few torches and only one attendant, who wordlessly handed them towels and then went off into the steam to manage the valves that adjusted the water temperature. "The big pool there gets hotter the closer you go toward the far end," Silk told Garion and Leldorin as they all disrobed. Some people say you should go in until it's as hot as you can stand it, but I prefer just to pick a comfortable temperature and soak. He splashed down into the water. Are you sure we'll be alone here? Garion asked nervously. I don't think I'd care to have a group of ladies come trooping in while I'm trying to bathe. The women's baths are separate, Silk assured him. The Revens are very proper about that sort of things. About that sort of things. Weird. They aren't nearly as advanced as the Tolnedrans yet. Are you really sure that bathing in the winter-time is healthy? Leldorin asked, eyeing the steaming water suspiciously. Garion plunged into the pool and moved quickly out of the tepid water at the near end toward the hotter area. I don't think I remember the part about the rotten potato. Maybe I've read a different version. The steam rose more thickly as he waded out into the pool, and the pair of torches set in rings on the back wall receded into a kind of ruddy glow. Ah, I see. The tiled walls echoed back the sounds of their voices and splashing with a peculiar cavern-like hollowness. The steam eddied up out of the water, and he found himself suddenly shut off by it, separated from his friends in the hazy dimness. The hot water relaxed him, and he seemed almost to want to float, half aware, and let it soak out all memory, all the past and all the future. Dreamily he lay back, and then, not knowing why, he allowed himself to sink beneath the dark, steaming water. How long he floated, his eyes closed and all sense suspended, he could not have said. But finally his face rose to the surface and he stood up, the water streaming out of his hair and down across his shoulders. He felt strangely purified by his immersion. And then the sun broke through the tattered cloud outside for a moment, and a single shaft of sunlight streamed down through a small grilled window to fall fully upon Garion. The sudden light was diffused by the steam and seemed to flicker with an opalescent fire. Hail, Belgarion, the voice in his mind said to him. I greet thee on this Aristide. There was no hint of the usual amusement in the voice, and the formality seemed strange, significant. Thank you, Garion replied gravely, and they did not speak again. The steam rose and eddied about him as he waded back toward the cooler reaches of the pool, where Silk and Leldorin, both sunk to their necks in warm water, were talking quietly together. About half an hour before noon, Garion, in response to a summons from Aunt Pol, walked down a long stone corridor toward a room a few steps from the huge carved doors that gave entrance into the hall of the Reven King. He was wearing his best doublet and hose, and his soft leather half-boots had been brushed until they glowed. Aunt Pol wore a deep blue robe, cowled and belted at the waist. I feel like it's been a little while since we've seen her in that. For once, Belgarath, also blue-robed, oh, not white, but blue, did not look rumpled or spotted. Rumpled. I don't know why that was funny to me. Just read out loud. Try saying it. Rumpled. I swear it's just water and some, like, flavor syrup in this cup. The old man's face was very serious. As he and Aunt Pol spoke together, there was no hint of the banter that usually marked their conversation. Seated quietly in the corner of the little room, Errand, dressed all in white linen, gravely watched. He's always so grave. Well, not always. Sometimes he's laughing and kissing and what have you. You look very nice, Garion, Aunt Pol said, reaching out to smooth his sandy hair back from his forehead. Shouldn't we go inside? Garion asked. He had seen others, gray-clad ravens and the more brightly garbed visitors, entering the hall. We will, Garion, she replied, all in good time. She turned to Belgarath. How long? She asked. Another quarter hour or so, he replied. Is everything ready? Ask Garion, the old man told her. I've taken care of everything I can. The rest is up to him. Aunt Pol turned to Garion then, her eyes very serious, and the white lock at her brow gleaming silver in the darkness of her hair. Well, Garion, she asked, are you ready? He looked at her, baffled. I had the oddest dream last night, he said. Everyone kept asking me that same question. What does it mean, Aunt Pol? Am I ready for what? That'll become clearer in a bit, Belgarath told him. Take out your amulet. You'll wear it on the outside of your clothes today. I thought it was supposed to be out of sight. Today's different, the old man replied. As a matter of fact, today's unlike any day I've ever seen. And I've seen a lot of them. Because it's Aristide? That's part of it. Belgarath reached inside his robe and drew out his own silver medallion. He glanced at it briefly. It's getting a little worn, he noted. Then he smiled. But then, so am I suppose. Aunt Pol drew out her own amulet. She and Belgarath each reached out to take Garion's hands, and then to join their own. It's been a long time coming, Polgara, Belgarath said. Yes, it has, Father, Aunt Pol agreed. Any regrets? I can live with them, old wolf. Let's go in, then. Garion started toward the door. Not you, Garion, Aunt Pol told him. You will wait here with Errand. You two will come in later. You'll send somebody for us? He asked her. What I mean is, how will we know when we're supposed to come in? You'll know, Belgarath told him. And then they left him alone with Errand. They didn't give us very complete instructions, did they? Garion said to the child. I hope we don't make any mistakes. Errand smiled confidently, reached out, and put his small hand in Garion's. At his touch, the song of the orb filled Garion's mind again, sponging away his worries and doubts. He could not have said how long he stood holding the child's hand and immersed in that song. It's come at last, Belgarion. The voice seemed to come from outside somehow, no longer confined within Garion's mind, and the look on Errand's face made it quite clear that he could also hear the words. Is this what I'm supposed to do? Garion asked. It's part of it, What are they doing in there? Garion looked rather curiously toward the door. They're getting the people in the hall ready for what's going to happen. Will they be ready? Will you? There was a pause. Are you ready, Belgarion? Yes, Garion replied. Whatever it is, I think I'm ready for it. Let's go, then. You'll tell me what to do? If it's necessary. With his hand still holding Erin's, Garion walked over toward the door. He raised his other hand to push it open, but it swung inexplicably open ahead of him before he touched it. There were 2 guards at the huge carved door a few steps down the hall, but they seemed frozen into immobility as Garion and Erin approached. Once again, Garion raised his hand, and the immense doors to the Hall of the Raven King swung silently open in response to his hand alone. The Hall of the Raven King was a huge, vaulted throne room with massive and ornately carved wooden buttresses supporting the ceiling beams. The walls were festooned with banners and green boughs, and hundreds of candles burned in iron sconces. 3 great stone fire pits were set at intervals in the floor. Instead of logs, blocks of peat glowed in the pits. We knew about that, didn't we? Radiating an even, fragrant warmth. The hall was crowded, but there was a broad avenue of blue carpet leading from the doors to the throne. Yes, peat bogs. Garion's eyes, however, scarcely noted the crowd. His thoughts seemed suspended by the song of the orb, which now filled his mind completely. Bemused, freed of all thought or fear or hint of self-consciousness, he walked with Erin close beside him toward the front of the hall where Aunt Pol and Belgarath stood, one on each side of the throne. The throne of the Raven King had been chiseled from a single basalt block. You know, I didn't really think we'd be coming across that word again anytime soon. Apparently it should have been on the bingo sheet. Okay. Its back and arms were all one height, and there was a massiveness about it that made it seem more permanent than the mountains themselves. It sat solidly against the wall, and, hanging point downward above it, was a great sword. Somewhere in the citadel, a bell had begun to peal, and the sound of it mingled with the song of the orb as Garion and Erin moved down the long, carpeted pathway toward the front of the hall. As they passed each sconce, the candles inexplicably dropped to the merest pinpoint. There was no draught, no flickering, as, one by one, the candles dimmed and the hall filled with deepening shadow. When they reached the front of the hall, Belgarath, his face a mystery, looked gravely at them for a moment, then looked out at the throng assembled in the hall of the Raven King. I'm going to do Belgarath's speaking voice for this. "Behold, the orb of Aldor," he announced in a solemn voice. As we know, Belgarath is a storyteller and can choose to not be all gravelly if he wants, right? We all know that. Erin released Garion's hand, tugged open the pouch, and reached inside. As he turned to face the darkened hall, Erin drew the round gray stone out of the pouch and lifted it with both hands, displaying it for all to see. The song of the orb was overpowering. Joining with it, there was a kind of vast, shimmering sound. The sound seemed to soar, rising, ringing higher and higher as Garion stood beside the child, looking at the faces of the assemblage. Within the stone Erend held aloft, there seemed to be a pinpoint of intense blue light. The light grew brighter as the shimmering sound rose higher. The faces before him were all familiar, Garion could see. Barak was there, and Leldoran, Hetar, Dernick, Silk, and Mandaralin. Seated in a royal box beside the Tolnedran ambassador, with Adara and Ariana directly behind her, was Sinedra, looking every inch an imperial princess. But, mingled somehow with the familiar faces, were others. Strange, stark faces, each so caught up in a single overriding identity that they seemed almost mask-like. Mingled with Barak was the dreadful bear, and Hetar bore with him the sense of thousands upon thousands of horses. With Silk stood the figure of the guide, and with Relg that of the blind man. Leldoran was the archer, and Mandaralin the knight protector. Seeming to hover in the air above Taiba was the sorrowing form of the mother of the race that died, and her sorrow was like the sorrow of Mara. And Sinedra was no longer a princess, but now a queen, the one Ktuchik had called the Queen of the World. Strangest of all, Dernick, good, solid Dernick, stood with his 2 lives plainly evident on his face. In the searing blue light of the orb, and with the strange sound shimmering in his ears, Garion looked in wonder at his friends, realizing with amazement that he was seeing for the first time what Belgarath and Aunt Pol had seen all along. From behind him, he heard Aunt Pol speak, her voice calm and very gentle. "Your task is completed, Erend. You may now give up the orb." The little boy, crowed with delight, turned and presented the glowing orb to Garion. Uncomprehending, Garion stared at the fiery stone. He could not take it. It was death to touch the orb. "Reach forth thy hand, Belgarion, and receive thy birthright from the child who hath borne it unto thee." It was the familiar voice, and yet, at the same time, it was not. When this voice spoke, there was no possibility of refusal. Garion's hand stretched out without his even being aware that it was moving. "Erend!" the child declared, firmly depositing the orb in Garion's outstretched hand. Garion felt the peculiar, seething touch of it against the mark on his palm. It was alive. He could feel the life in it, even as he stared in blank incomprehension at the living fire he held in his naked hand. "Return the orb to the pommel of the sword of the Revan King," the voice instructed, and Garion turned with instant, unthinking obedience. He stepped up onto the seat of the basalt throne, and then onto the wide ledge formed by its back and arms. He stretched up, taking hold of the huge sword hilt to steady himself, and placed the orb on the great sword's pommel. There was a faint, but clearly audible click as the orb and the sword became one, and Garion could feel the living force of the orb surging down through the hilt he gripped in one hand. The great blade began to glow, and the shimmering sound rose yet another octave. Then the huge weapon, quite suddenly, came free from the wall to which it had been attached for so many centuries. The throng in the hall gasped. As the sword began to drop free, Garion caught hold of the hilt with both hands, half turning as he did so. striving to keep the great blade from falling to the floor. What pulled him off balance was the fact that it had no apparent weight. The sword was so huge that he should not have been able to hold it, much less lift it, but as he braced himself with his feet wide spread and his shoulders pressed back against the wall, the point of the sword rose easily until the great blade stood upright before him. He stared at it in amazement, feeling a strange throbbing between the hands he had clasped about the hilt. The orb flared and began to pulsate. Then, as the shimmering sound soared into a mighty crescendo of jubilation, the sword of the Revan King burst into a great tongue of searing blue flame. Without knowing why, Garion lifted the flaming sword over his head with both hands, staring up at it in wonder. "Let Aloria rejoice!" Belgarath called out in a voice like thunder. "For the Revan King has returned! All hail Belgarion, King of Riva and Overlord of the West!" And yet, in the midst of the turmoil that followed, and even with the shimmering chorus of what seemed a million voices raised in exultation echoing from one end of the universe to the other, there was a sullen clang of iron, as if the rust-scoured door of some dark tomb had suddenly burst open, and the sound of that clanging chilled Garion's heart. A voice echoed hollowly from the tomb, and it did not join the universal rejoicing. Ripped from its centuries of slumber, the voice in the tomb awoke, raging and crying out for blood. Stunned past all thought, Garion stood with his flaming sword aloft, as, with a steely rustle, the assembled Alorns unsheathed their swords to raise them in salute. "Hail, Belgarion, my king!" Brand, the Revan warder, boomed, sinking to one knee and lifting his sword. His 4 sons knelt behind him, their swords also lifted. "Hail, Belgarion, King of Riva!" they cried. "Hail, Belgarion!" The great shout shook the hall of the Revan King, and a forest of upraised swords glittered in the fiery blue light of the flaming blade in Garion's hands. Somewhere within the citadel, a bell began to peal. Again, I guess. As the news raced through the breathless city below, other bells caught the sound, and their iron rejoicing echoed back from the rocky crags to announce to the icy waters of the sea the return of the Revan King. One in the hall, however, did not rejoice. In the instant that the kindling of the sword had irrevocably announced Garion's identity, Princess Senedra had started to her feet, her face deathly pale and her eyes wide with absolute consternation. She had instantly grasped something that had eluded him, something so unsettling that it drained the color from her face and brought her to her feet to stare at him with an expression of total dismay. Then there suddenly burst from the lips of the Imperial Princess Senedra a wail of outrage and protest. With a voice that rang in the rafters, she cried out, "Oh, no!" And that's the end of chapter 11. Well, that's been a long time coming, hasn't it? Ah, boy. So, Sharkies, how long ago did you see this moment coming? I'm curious. Yeah, I think that it's more what the Sharkies said. It was a something that she knew was never going to go anywhere. And so therefore, didn't really matter that much. Certainly saw it coming the first book. Yeah. So the first time I read these books, I must have been in my early teens. And in retrospect, I'm quite ashamed to say that I don't think I saw it coming. Rereading it since then, there are so many clues scattered throughout the whole thing, but somehow I don't know, I guess I wasn't thinking that far ahead. Yeah, yeah, because I definitely asked you to read the books. I feel like the camera keeps kind of, I don't know if it's trying to focus on Bin or something, but it keeps kind of focusing in and out for some reason. So yeah, the first time I read these books, when I was, much, much younger, I feel like I was actually a little surprised at this point. Hmm. Well, I feel like we got to go back. Like, we've only read half a chapter, so we've got to continue into chapter 12. Them's the rules. Ready to see how this changes things for Garion? It's not a small change. He's just gone from, you know, he was related to Aunt Pol and Belgarath. So he wasn't a nobody, but not that many people knew who he was. And now everyone is going to know who he is, right? Now he's, in a lot of people's eyes, he's going to be the most important person, like, there is. Yeah. So, let's see how he feels about it. The worst part of it all was that people kept bowing to him. First line of chapter 12. The worst part of it all was that people kept bowing to him. Garion had not the slightest idea of how he should respond. Should he bow back? Should he nod slightly in acknowledgement? Or perhaps it not be better just to ignore the whole business and act as if he hadn't seen it, or something. But what was he supposed to do when someone called him Your Majesty? Does it? That is a good question. He literally has no choice at this point. There's no avoiding it. The events of the previous day were still a confused blur in his mind. He seemed to remember being presented to the people of the city, standing on the battlements of Iron Grip's citadel with a great cheering throng below and the huge sword that somehow seemed weightless still blazing in his hands. Stupendous as they were, however, the overt events of the day were unimportant when compared to things which were taking place on a different level of reality. Enormous forces had focused on the moment of the revelation of the Raven King, and Garion was still numb as a result of things he had seen and perceived in that blinding instant when he had at last, discovered who he was. There had been endless congratulations and a great many preparations for his coronation, but all of that blurred in his mind. Had his life depended upon it, he could not have given a rational, coherent account of the day's events. Just lean it on the wall. Or are you just stick it in a fireplace? Is that where it's gonna go? Today promised to be even worse. If that were possible. He had not slept well. For one thing, the great bed in the royal apartments to which he had been escorted the previous evening was definitely uncomfortable. It had great round posts rising from each corner, and it was canopied and curtained in purple velvet. It seemed much too large for him, and it was noticeably on the soft side. For the past year and more, he had done most of his sleeping on the ground, and the down-filled mattress on the royal bed was too yielding to be comfortable. There was, moreover, the sure and certain knowledge that as soon as he arose, he was going to be the absolute center of attention. On the whole, he decided, it might just be simpler to stay in bed. The more he thought about that, the better it sounded. The door to the royal bedchamber, however, was not locked. Sometime not long after sunrise, it swung open, and Garion could hear someone moving around. Curious, he peeked through the purple drapery enclosing his bed. A sober-looking servant was busily opening the drapes at the window and stirring up the fire. Garion's attention, however, moved immediately to the large, covered, silver tray sitting on the table by the fireplace. His nose recognized sausage, and warm, fresh-baked bread, and butter. There was definitely butter involved somewhere on that tray. His stomach began to speak to him in a loud voice. The servant glanced around the room to make sure everything was in order, then came to the bed with a no-nonsense expression. Garion burrowed quickly back under the covers. "Breakfast, Your Majesty," the servant announced firmly, drawing the curtains open and tying them back. Is that his stomach this time? Garion sighed. Quite obviously, decisions about staying in bed were not his to make. "Thank you," he replied. "Does Your Majesty require anything else?" the servant asked solicitously, holding open a robe for Garion to put on. No, not right now, thank you," Garion answered, climbing out of the royal bed and down the 3 carpeted steps leading up to it. The servant helped him into the robe, then bowed and quietly left the room. Garion went to the table, seated himself, lifted the cover from the tray, and assaulted breakfast vigorously. When he had finished eating, he sat for a time in a large, blue-upholstered armchair looking out the window at the snowy crags looming above the city. The storm that had raked the coast for days had blown off, at least for the moment. The winter sun was bright, and the morning sky very blue. The young Revan king stared for a time out his window, lost in thought. Something nagged at the back of his memory. Something he had heard once, but had since forgotten.
It seemed that there was something he ought to remember that involved Princess Sinedra. The tiny girl had fled from the hall of the Raven King almost immediately after the sword had so flamboyantly announced his identity the previous day. He was fairly sure that it was all mixed together. Whatever it was that he was trying to recall had been directly involved in her flight. With some people, it might be better to let things quiet down before clearing the air, but Garion knew that this was not the proper way to deal with Sinedra. Things should never be allowed to fester in her mind. That only made matters worse. He sighed and began to dress. As he walked purposefully through the corridors, he met with startled looks and hasty bows. He soon realized that the events of the preceding day had forever robbed him of his anonymity. Someone, Garion could never catch a glimpse of his face, even went so far as to follow him, probably in the hope of performing some service. Whoever it was kept a discreet distance behind, but Garion caught occasional glimpses of him far back along the corridor, a gray-cloaked man who moved on strangely noiseless feet. Garion did not like being followed, whatever the reason, but he resisted the urge to turn around and tell the man to go away. The Princess Sinedra had been given several rooms just down the hall from Aunt Pol's apartments, and Garion steeled himself as he raised his hand to rap on the door. "Your Majesty," Sinedra's maid greeted him with a startled curtsy. "Would you please ask Her Highness if I might have a word with her?" Garion asked. "Certainly, Your Majesty," the girl replied, and darted into the next chamber. There was a brief murmur of voices, and then Sinedra swept into the room. She wore a plain gown, and her face was as pale as it had been the previous day. "Your Majesty," she greeted him in an icy voice, and then she curtsied, a stiff little curtsy that spoke whole volumes. "Something's bothering you," Garion said bluntly. "Would you like to get it out in the open?" "Whatever your Majesty wishes," she replied. "Do we have to do this?" "I can't imagine what your Majesty is talking about." "Don't you think we know each other well enough to be honest?" "Of course. I suppose I'd better accustom myself to obeying your Majesty immediately." "What's that supposed to mean?" "Don't pretend that you don't know," she flared. "Sinedra, I haven't the faintest idea what you're talking about." She looked at him suspiciously. Then her eyes softened just a bit. "Perhaps you don't at that," she murmured. "Have you ever read the Accords of Vomimbre?" "You taught me how to read yourself," he reminded her. Good line. "About 6 or 8 months ago. You know every book I've read. You gave me most of them yourself." "That's true, isn't it?" she said. "Wait just a moment. I'll be right back." She went briefly into the adjoining room and returned with a rolled parchment. "I'll read it to you," she told him. "Some of the words are a little difficult." "I'm not that stupid," he objected. But she had already begun to read. "And when it shall come to pass that the Raven King returns, he shall have lordship and dominion, and swear we all fealty to him as overlord of the kingdoms of the West. And He shall have an imperial princess of Tolnedra to wife, and— Wait a minute. Garion interrupted her with a strangled note in his voice. Was there something you didn't understand? It all seems quite clear to me. What was that last part again? He shall have an imperial princess of Tolnedra to wife, and— Are there any other princesses in Tolnedra? Not that I know of. Then that means— He gaped at her. Precisely. She said it like a steel trap suddenly snapping shut. Is that why you ran out of the hall yesterday? I did not run. You don't want to marry me. It was almost an accusation. I didn't say that. Then you do want to marry me? I didn't say that either. But it doesn't really matter, does it? We don't have any choice at all. Neither one of us. Is that what's bothering you? Her look was lofty. Of course not. I've always known that my husband would be selected for me. What's the problem, then? I'm an imperial princess, Garion. I know that. I'm not accustomed to being anyone's inferior. Inferior? To who? Whom? The Accords state that you are the overlord of the West. What does that mean? It means, Your Majesty, that you outrank me. Is that all that's got you so upset? Her look was like a drawn dagger. With Your Majesty's permission, I believe I'd like to withdraw. And without waiting for an answer, she swept from the room. Garion stared after her. This was going too far. He considered going immediately to Aunt Pol to protest, but the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that she would be totally unsympathetic. Too many little things began to click together all at once. Aunt Pol was not merely a party to this absurd notion. She had actively done everything in her power to make absolutely sure that there was no escape for him. He needed someone to talk to, someone devious enough and unscrupulous enough to think a way out of this. He left Sinedra's sitting room and went looking for Silk. The little man was not in his room, and the servant who was making up the bed kept bowing as he stammered out his apologies at not having the slightest notion of where Silk might be. Garion left quickly. Since the apartment Barak shared with his wife and children was only a few steps down the corridor, Garion went there, trying not to look back at the gray-cloaked attendant he knew was still following him. Barak, he said, knocking on the big Cherek's door. It's me, Garion. May I come in? The Lady Merrill opened the door immediately and curtsied respectfully. Please don't do that, Garion begged her.
What's the trouble, Garion?
Barak asked from the green-covered chair where he sat, bouncing his infant son on his knee. I'm looking for Silk, Garion replied, entering the large, comfortable room that was littered with clothes and children's toys.
You're a little wild around the eyes,
the big man noted.
Is something wrong?
I've just had some very unsettling news, Garion told him, shuddering. I need to talk to Silk. Maybe he can come up with an answer for me. Would you like some breakfast? Lady Merrill suggested. I've already eaten, thank you, Garion replied. He looked at her a bit more closely. She had undone the rather severe braids she customarily wore, and her blonde hair framed her face softly. I think I'd forgotten that she was blonde. I don't usually picture her as blonde. She wore her usual green gown, but her carriage seemed not to have the rigidity it had always had. Barak, Garion noted, had also lost a bit of the grim defensiveness that had always been there previously when he was in the presence of his wife. Barak's 2 daughters entered the room then, one on each side of Erend. They all sat down in the corner and began playing an elaborate little game that seemed to involve a great deal of giggling.
I think my daughters have decided to steal him,
Barak grinned.
Quite suddenly, I'm up to my ears in wife and children. And the funny part about it is that I don't seem to mind it at all.
Merrill threw him a quick, almost shy smile. Then she looked over at the laughing children. The girls absolutely adore him, she said, and then turned back to Garion. Have you ever noticed that you can't look directly into his eyes for more than a moment or so? He seems to be looking right into your heart. Garion nodded. I think it might have something to do with the way he trusts everybody, he suggested. He turned back to Barak. Do you have any idea where I might find Silk?
Barak laughed. Walk up and down the halls and listen for the rattle of dice. The little thief's been gambling ever since we got here. Dernick might know. He's been hiding out in the stables. Royalty makes him nervous.
It does the same thing to me, Garion said. But you are royalty, Garion, Merrill reminded him. That makes me even more nervous, he replied. There was a series of back hallways that led to the stables. And Garion decided to follow that route, rather than pass through the more stately corridors where he might encounter members of the nobility. These narrower passageways were used for the most part by servants going to and fro from the kitchen, and Garion reasoned that most of the minor household staff would probably not recognize him yet. As he walked quickly along one of the passageways with his head down to avoid any chance recognition, he caught another glimpse behind him of the man who had dogged his steps ever since he had left the royal apartments. Irritated finally to the point where he no longer cared about concealing his identity, Garion turned to confront his pursuer. I know you're there, he declared. Come out where I can see you. He waited, tapping his foot impatiently. The hallway behind him remained empty and silent. Come out here at once, Garion repeated, his voice taking on an unaccustomed note of command. But there was no movement, no sound. Garion thought for a moment of retracing his steps to catch this persistent attendant in the act of creeping along behind him. But just then a servant carrying a tray of dirty dishes came along from the direction Garion had just come. Did you see anybody back there? Garion asked him. Back where? The servant said, obviously not recognizing his king. Back along the hall. The servant shook his head. I haven't seen anyone since I left the apartments of the King of Drasnia, he replied. Would you believe that this is his 3rd breakfast? I've never seen anybody eat so much. He looked curiously at Garion. You shouldn't be back here, you know, he warned. If the head cook catches you, he'll thrash you. He doesn't like anybody in this hall who doesn't have business here. I'm just on my way to the stables, Garion told him. I'd move right along, then. The head cook's got a vicious temper. I'll keep that in mind, Garion assured him. Leldorin was coming out of the stable, and he gave Garion a startled look as the two of them approached each other in the snowy courtyard. "How did you manage to escape from all the officials?" he asked. Then, as if remembering, he bowed. "Please don't do that, Leldorin," Garion told him. "The situation is a bit awkward, isn't it?" Leldorin agreed. "We'll behave toward each other the same as we've always behaved," Garion said firmly. "At least until they tell us we can't. Have you any idea where Silk might be?" "I saw him earlier this morning," Leldorin replied. "He said he was going to visit the baths. He looked a bit unwell. I think he celebrated last night." "Let's go find him," Garion suggested. "I've got to talk to him." They found Silk sitting in a tiled stone room thick with steam. The little man had a towel about his waist, and he was sweating profusely. "Are you sure this is good for you?" Garion asked, waving his hand in front of his face to clear an eddying cloud of steam. "Nothing would really be good for me this morning, Garion," Silk replied sadly. He put his elbows on his knees and sank his face miserably into his hands. "Are you sick?" "Horribly." "If you knew it was going to make you feel this way, why did you drink so much last night?" "It seemed like a good idea at the time. At least I think it did. I seem to have lost track of several hours." An attendant brought the suffering man a foaming tankard, and Silk drank deeply. "Is that really wise?" Leldorin asked him. Well, when Leldorin is asking you if something is wise. "Probably not," Silk admitted with a shudder. "But it's the best I could come up with on short notice." He shuddered again. "I feel absolutely wretched," he declared. "Was there anything in particular you wanted?" "I've got a problem," Garion blurted. He looked quickly at Leldorin. "I'd rather this didn't go beyond the three of us," he said. "You have my oath on it," Leldorin responded instantly. "Thank you, Leldorin." It was easier to accept the oath than try to explain why it wasn't really necessary. "I've just read the Accords of Vomimbre," he told them. "Actually, I had them read to me." "Did you know that I'm supposed to marry Senedra?" "I hadn't actually put that part together yet," Silk admitted. "But the Accords do mention something about it, don't they?" "Congratulations, Garion!" Leldorin exclaimed, suddenly clapping his friend on the shoulder. "She's a beautiful girl." Garion ignored that. "Can you think of some way I can get out of it?" he demanded of Silk. "Garion, right now I can't really think of anything except how awful I feel. My first hunch, though, is that there isn't any way out for you. Every kingdom in the West is signatory to the Accords, and I think that the prophecy's involved too." "I'd forgotten about that," Garion admitted glumly. "I'm sure they'll give you time to get used to the idea," Leldorin said. "But how much time will they give Senedra? I talked to her this morning, and she's not happy about the idea at all." "She doesn't actually dislike you," Silk told him. "That's not what the problem is. She seems to think that I outrank her, and that's what's got her upset." Silk began to laugh weakly. "A real friend wouldn't laugh," Garion accused him. Is rank really that important to your princess? Leldorin asked. Probably not much more important than her right arm, Garion replied sourly. I think she reminds herself that she's an imperial princess 6 or 8 times every hour. She makes a pretty big issue about it. Now I come along from out of nowhere, and suddenly I outrank her. It's the sort of thing that's going to set her teeth on edge. Permanently, I expect. He stopped and looked rather closely at Silk. Do you think there's any chance of your getting well today? What have you got in mind? Do you know your way around Riva at all? Naturally. I was sort of thinking that I ought to go down into the city, not with trumpets blowing and all that, but just dressed like somebody ordinary. I don't know anything at all about the Rivans, and now... He faltered with it. And now you're their king, Leldorin finished for him. It's probably not a bad idea, Silk agreed. Though I can't really say for sure. My brain isn't working too well just now. It'll have to be today, of course. Your coronation's scheduled for tomorrow, and your movements are likely to be restricted after they've put the crown on your head. Garion didn't want to think about that. I hope the 2 of you don't mind if I take a little while to pull myself together first, though, Silk added, drinking from the tankard again. Actually, it doesn't really matter if you mind or not. It's a question of necessity. It took the rat-faced little man only about an hour to recuperate. His remedies were brutally direct. He soaked up hot steam and cold ale in approximately equal amounts, then emerged from the steam room to plunge directly into a pool of icy water. He was blue and shaking when he came out, but the worst of his indisposition seemed to be gone. He carefully selected nondescript clothes for the 3 of them, then led the way out of the citadel by way of a side gate. As they left, Garion glanced back several times, but he seemed to have shaken off the persistent attendant who had been following him all morning. Or an actor. As they wandered down into the city, Garion was struck again by the bleak severity of the place. The outsides of the houses were uniformly gray and totally lacking any form of exterior decoration. They were solid, square, and absolutely colorless. The gray cloak, which was the outstanding feature of the Rivan national costume, gave the people in the narrow streets an appearance of that same grimness. We found our home for the series. Garion quailed a bit at the thought of spending the rest of his life in so uninviting a place. They walked down a long street in pale winter sunshine, with the salt smell of the harbor strong in their nostrils, and past a house from which came the sound of children singing. This particular page is all mucked up at the bottom. Weird. Their voices were very clear, and merged together in subtle harmonies. Garion was astonished at the complexity of the children's song. "A national pastime," Silk said. "Rivans are very much involved in music. I suppose it helps relieve the boredom. I'd hate to offend your majesty, but your kingdom's a tedious sort of place." He looked around. "I have an old friend who lives not far from here. Why don't we pay him a visit?" He led them down a long stairway to the street below. Not far up that street, a large building stood solidly on the downhill side. Silk strode up to the door and knocked. After a moment, a Revan in a burn-spotted leather smock answered.
"Radek, old friend,"
he said with a certain surprise.
"I haven't seen you in years."
"Torgen!" Silk grinned at him. "I thought I'd stop by and see how you were doing."
Come in,
Torgen said, opening the door wider. "You've expanded things a bit, I see," Silk noticed, looking around.
"The market's been good to me,"
Torgen replied modestly.
"The perfume makers in Tol Barun are buying just about any kind of bottle they can get."
The Revan was a solid-looking man with iron-gray hair and strangely rounded and rosy cheeks. He glanced curiously at Garion and frowned slightly, as if trying to remember something. Garion turned to examine a row of delicate little glass bottles standing neatly on a nearby table, trying to keep his face turned away. "You're concentrating on bottle-making, then?" Silk asked.
"Oh, we still try to turn out a few good pieces,"
Torgen replied a bit ruefully.
"I've got an apprentice who's an absolute genius. I have to let him spend a certain amount of time on his own work. I'm afraid that if I kept him blowing bottles all day, he'd leave me."
The glassmaker opened a cabinet and carefully took out a small velvet-wrapped bundle.
"This is a piece of his work,"
he said, folding back the cloth. It was a crystal wren, W-R-E-N. Wings half spread, and it was perched on a leafy twig with buds at its tip. The entire piece was so detailed that even the individual feathers were clearly visible.
"Amazing!"
Silk gasped, examining the glass bird.
"This is exquisite, Torgen. How did he get the colors so perfect?" "I have no idea," Torgen admitted. "He doesn't even measure when he mixes, and the colors always come out exactly right. As I said, he's a genius."
He carefully rewrapped the crystal bird and placed it back in the cabinet. There were living quarters behind the workshop, and the rooms were filled with warmth and affection, and vibrant colors. Brightly colored cushions were everywhere, and paintings hung on the walls in every room. Torgen's apprentices seemed to be not so much workers as members of his family, and his eldest daughter played for them as they concentrated on the molten glass, her fingers touching the strings of her harp in cascading waterfalls of music. "It's so unlike the outside," Leldorin observed, his face puzzled. "What's that?" Silk asked him. "The outside is so grim, so stiff and gray, but once you come inside the building, it's all warmth and color." Torgen smiled.
"It's something outsiders don't expect," he agreed. "Our houses are very much like ourselves. Out of necessity, the outside is bleak. The city of Riva was built to defend the orb, and every house is part of the overall fortifications. We can't change the outside, but inside we have art and poetry and music. We ourselves wear the grey cloak. It's a useful garment, woven from the wool of goats, light, warm, nearly waterproof. But it won't accept dye, so it's always grey. But even though we're grey on the outside, that doesn't mean that we have no love of beauty." The more Garion thought about that, the more he began to understand these bleak-appearing islanders. The stiff reserve of the grey-cloaked Revans was a face they presented to the world. Behind that face, however, was an altogether different kind of people. The apprentices, for the most part, were blowing the delicate little bottles that were the major item in the trade with the perfume makers of Tol Barun. One apprentice, however, worked alone, fashioning a glass ship cresting a crystal wave. He was a sandy-haired young man with an intent expression,
When he looked up from his work and saw Garion, his eyes widened, but he lowered his head quickly to his work once again. Just work again, no once there. Back at the front of the shop, as they were preparing to leave, Garion asked to look once more at the delicate glass bird perched on its gleaming twig. The piece was so beautiful that it made his heart ache. "Does it please your Majesty?" It was the young apprentice, who had quietly entered from the workroom. He spoke softly. "I was in the square yesterday when Brand introduced you to the people," he explained. "I recognized you as soon as I saw you." "What's your name?" Garion asked curiously. "Joran, your Majesty," the apprentice replied. "Do you suppose we could skip the Majesties?" Garion said, rather plaintively. "I'm not really comfortable with that sort of thing yet. The whole business came as a complete surprise to me." Joran grinned at him. "There are all kinds of rumors in the city. They say you were raised by Belgarath the sorcerer in his tower in the Vale of Aldur." "Actually, I was raised in Sandaria by my Aunt Pol, Belgarath's daughter." "Polgara the sorceress?" Joran looked impressed. "Is she as beautiful as men say she is?" "I've always thought so." "Can she really turn herself into a dragon?" "I suppose she could if she wanted to," Garion admitted. "But she prefers the shape of an owl. She loves birds for some reason, and birds go wild at the sight of her. They talk to her all the time." "What an amazing thing," Joran marveled. "I'd give anything to be able to meet her." He pursed his lips thoughtfully, hesitating a moment. "Do you think she'd like this little thing?" he blurted finally, touching the crystal wren. "Like it?" Garion said. "She'd love it." "Would you give it to her for me?" "Joran!" Garion was startled at the idea. "I couldn't take it. It's too valuable, and I don't have any money to pay you for it." Joran smiled shyly. "It's only glass," he pointed out, "and glass is only melted sand, and sand's the cheapest thing in the world. If you think she'd like it, I'd really like for her to have it. Would you take it to her for me? Please? Tell her it's a gift from Joran the glassmaker." "I will, Joran," Garion promised, impulsively clasping the young man's hand. "I'll be proud to carry it to her for you." "I'll wrap it," Joran said then. "It's not good for glass to go out in the cold from a warm room." He reached for the piece of velvet, then stopped. "I'm not being entirely honest with you," he admitted, looking a bit guilty. "The wren's a very good piece, and if the nobles up at the Citadel see it, they might want me to make other things for them. I need a few commissions if I'm ever going to open my own shop, and—" He glanced once at Torgon's daughter, his heart in his eyes. "And you can't get married until you've established your own business?" Garion suggested. "Your Majesty will be a very wise king," Joran said gravely. "If I can get past all the blunders I'll make during the first few weeks," Garion added ruefully. "First few weeks, that's optimistic." Later that afternoon, he delivered the crystal bird to Aunt Pol in her private apartment. "What's this?" she asked, taking the cloth-wrapped object. "It's a present for you from a young glassmaker I met down in the city," Garion replied. "He insisted that I give it to you. His name's Joran. Be careful. I think it's kind of fragile." Aunt Pol gently unwrapped the crystal piece. Her eyes slowly widened as she stared at the exquisitely wrought bird. "Oh, Garion," she murmured, "it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "He's awfully good," Garion told her. "He works for a glassmaker called Torgon, and Torgon says he's a genius. He wants to meet you." "And I want to meet him," she breathed, her eyes lost in the glowing detail of the glass figure. Then she carefully set the crystal wren down on a table. Her hands were trembling, and her glorious eyes were full of tears. "What's wrong, Aunt Pol?" Garion asked her, slightly alarmed. "Nothing, Garion," she replied. "Nothing at all." "Why are you crying, then?" "You'd never understand, dear," she told him. Then she put her arms around him and pulled him to her in an almost fierce embrace. The coronation took place at noon the following day. The hall of the Raven King was full to overflowing with nobles and royalty, and the city below was alive with the sound of bells. Garion could never actually remember very much of his coronation. He did remember that the ermine-bordered cape was hot, and that the plain gold crown the Raven Deacon placed on his head was very heavy. What stood out most in his mind was the way the Orb of Aldur filled the entire hall with an intense blue light that grew brighter and brighter as he approached the throne, and overwhelmed his ears with that strange, exultant song he always seemed to hear whenever he came near it. The song of the orb was so loud that he scarcely heard the great cheer that greeted him as he turned, robed and crowned, to face the throng in the hall of the Raven King. He did, however, hear one voice very clearly. "Hail, Belgarion," the voice in his mind said quietly to him. And that's the end of chapter 12. Our boy is now king. So clearly everyone knew that was coming, but did you think it was going to happen like midway through the second to last book? Because we've still got a whole book and more to read. It's interesting, I thought. Like, it's an interesting time for it. Not at the end of the story. It's not, the story ends, he's king, everything's well. It's, it's sort of in the middle here. Not middle, but not at the end. And, further to that, there is an entire further set of 5 books after the end of the Belgarion that pick up like right where this story ends. So, yeah, it's an interesting position that we are in now, where we've got lots more to read, but our young boy has become king. So it'll be interesting to see how that affects the story. How does everybody feel about this past chapter and a half? That's true. You've got the death of Smaug, and then the Battle of 5 Armies following that. And then Bilbo returns home. And I suppose, you consider the events of that book as all one story, proportionately the death of Smaug might be in about a similar position in terms of percentage of story remaining. Maybe? It's similar. But also I feel like the events of The Hobbit are frequently told from a less personal point of view. Right? You get things from Bilbo's perspective, but you also get this sort of larger narrative, right? And like Bilbo was unconscious for the Battle of 5 Armies, almost the entirety of it. So you don't really, that part of the story doesn't really take place in the book. It takes place in the book, but it doesn't really, you don't see it. You don't get a detailed account. Mrs. is less fond of a story in which the hero does the right thing by supernatural movement rather than summoning their own bravery and resources. Yeah, I agree with that. And definitely in this part of the story, specifically, Garion's got this voice in his head guiding him, and he's had that voice offering suggestions and showing him how to do certain things through certain key moments of the books. I mean, I would definitely draw certain parallels between this story, especially now that we've had this moment, and Star Wars. Right? I would not be surprised if this story was influenced in some ways by Star Wars. You're not fond of the story, but you'd rather have seen Garion demonstrate more human emotions and questions as he became king. See, now that, he's got the orb ringing in his head, but the not remembering things, I definitely, like, the feeling like he slept through it, like, when some big moments have happened in my life, especially moments where, if my adrenaline's going, or, momentous things are taking place, I've got blank spots in my memory where I'm like, I couldn't tell you details about that day. I couldn't tell you about what happened, on X moment, where some things have blurred together. Because, so far, yeah, it does. That's definitely what I think of. But yeah, so far, we're 2 days in this part of the story right here, right? Like, we had the day of presenting the orb and revealing that Garion is indeed, the Revan King returned. I guess 3 days. We had that day. We had the day after that, which is the day that he went down into the city and met the glassmaker. And then we've just sort of at the very end there had the day of his coronation. The cloak is heavy, the crown's heavy and uncomfortable, and the voice in his head saying, "Hail Belgarion." So he hasn't had very much time to deal with any of this yet. Well, and that is a theme in these books, obviously, right? It's been mentioned several times, pieces being moved on a chessboard sort of thing, and of course the whole naming scheme for the books. So him being sort of a tool for something else to use is definitely an ongoing theme, but also so is certain things him having to do himself. But this was a moment in destiny for sure. This had to happen. Well, hopefully that doesn't put too sour a taste in your mouth on these books. And we'll see how things unfold from here. Oh. Feeling slightly warm. He is making choices, right? He's trying to figure out how to deal with the aftermath of this thing happening. It's fully not in his control, him becoming king. And he's aware of that, and so is everyone close to him. He's not in control. Because Aunt Pol and Belgarath have been working at this for thousands of years to make sure this moment happened. But what happens next is going to be at least partly up to Garion. But I'm glad you still like the story. I mean, I would try to understand if you didn't, but I'd be a little sad. Prawn of Prophecy. Did you see there's a post going around over the past couple of days about why suddenly all names have gone out of my head? Farmos. Michael Caine, that's it. I kept thinking Michael Sheen, and I'm like, that's not it. It's not Michael Sheen. Michael Caine and Tim Curry. What? Yeah, Michael Caine and Tim Curry both work in their respective Muppet movies, and it said because Michael Caine acts like none of the Muppets are Muppets, and Tim Curry acts like he himself is a Muppet. I need to watch Muppet Treasure Island again. It's been a few years at this point, I think. But we did just watch Muppet Christmas Carol over... yeah, I'm pretty sure almost everything Muppet related is on Disney+. Because it's Disney. Yeah, we did watch Muppet Christmas Carol over the holidays because you gotta. Well, what do people think? Garion must stay in an uncomfortable situation. We don't have Garion being uncomfortable with royalty, don't we? Which is a little too bad, because that would be instantly filled in. He said it himself. I don't think Polgara specifically chastised him about manners. We did have... I don't know, it wasn't specifically Garion's magic being noisy, but the orb. The orb has been all kinds of noisy. So that's magic being noisy, but it's not Garion's. And then other than that... Yeah, Garion does something unexpected. I mean, we all expected it. I don't know if many other people did. I would claim that Garion did something unexpected to most people in his world. Because they all thought the Revan line was extinct. But yeah. The B1 and O1, I feel like, are both in the running for possibly being stamped in. Silk was too hungover to be sarcastic, I feel like. And the most roguish thing he did was, I guess, either a lot of drinking or taking a side gate out of the fortress. The Citadel. Wasn't even sardonic. No, his head hurt too much for sardonicness. Sardonism? Sardonality? Sardonoctitude? Sardonacy? He wouldn't want to think about it. We had a moment where I thought maybe Barak would suggest violence when he was talking about the Murgo King, but he just laughed about what had already happened. He didn't suggest anything new. He talked about previous violence. So, yeah. What do you think? Any thoughts? Should I stamp in a space or should I leave it for now? Crick. Sardonicism, apparently. All right. Farmo says no stamp. Sardonicism. I guess that lines up with, like, narcissism or kind of lines up with, like, sarcasm. Kind of. Okay, well, on Friday, we'll learn a little bit more about what Mrs. votes for uncomfortable situation. I think it could line up. Why don't we save it for Friday and we'll see how the next chapter goes. And we'll see whether it gets any more or less uncomfortable for him. I don't disagree with the must stay in an uncomfortable situation, but I'm okay with postponing it for a little bit. Just to see how things go. All right. I am glad we are through the coronation. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens next. And if Garion thinks of anything for this situation with Sinedra. The situation is not over, right? All right, have a good night, everyone. I'm hopefully going to go get some sleep. See if I can wake up bright and early tomorrow morning. So I'll see you on on Friday. See you on Friday. You'll see me on Friday, hopefully. Thank you. Anyway, come say goodnight. Come say goodnight to this snake. Good boy. Crunch. All right, good night, everyone. See you Friday.